Okie dokie, welcome back to another episode of Toolbox Talks on the SiteShed podcast. My name is Matt Jones, and today I am coming to you with an interesting topic of, I suppose, an evolution within the building industry. Like most industries, I suppose there is a lot of change going on within the way that things are being done today. The building industry, of course, is no different. So today I am speaking with a gentleman named Warren McGregor, who's from Prefab Oz, which basically is the member society who looks after prefabrication throughout Australia. And it was a very interesting conversation because, I know there's a lot of change going on in the building industry, and you only need to walk past a construction site today to see, the amount of concrete panels being dropped into place as opposed to the traditional style of walls being thrown up to realize, there is a lot of methods that are being changed in the space of these new technologies and these new sophistications, if you want to call them that. If you do a lot of traveling, you'll see around the world, there's a lot of examples of prefabrication in the space of bathrooms and all that kind of stuff. And of course, once you start seeing that, it's only a matter of time before it hits our shores here in Australia and around the world. It was a very interesting conversation. We covered off on a lot of things. Some of the key takeaways for me was certainly in the space of the design applications for some of these bathroom pods, which I found really quite fascinating, especially coming from a plumbing background. I was asking some pretty detailed questions there. Some of the materials that are being used and how there's environmental advantages due to the fact that you're not wasting so much material like you would normally when you're on site. There's a lot of wastage in the space of overcuts and that kind of thing, cut-offs. And then, of course, there's limitations, and of course, there's there's that whole conversation we had around the demand coming from the market, and where some of those bottlenecks currently lie. There is an event coming up as well called the Prefab Oz 2018 conference. It is in September of 2018 up in Brisbane in Australia. Whether or not this episode goes live in time for that, I'm not sure. However, I have certainly posted some links to that event within the Facebook community. So for you guys that are keen, by all means, go jump on the mailing list or start following their stuff, because they're going to do these every year. Next year, they're going to be running one in Sydney. And it's certainly going to be a space which I think we're going to see a lot of evolution. If you do like this topic, and if you're interested in that whole, I suppose, mantra of, where things are going from a design development point of view, I did actually have a similar podcast. Well, I won't say similar. I spoke to a gentleman back in January of 2017, Bill McCorkle from Archiblocks. We were talking about modular homes. That was quite similar, and Warren and Bill are actually colleagues and associates. That was episode 109, so definitely go and check that out. That, of course, is available wherever you consume your podcasting media. Anyway, that's all from me. So I hope you guys enjoy this podcast. If you've got any questions, by all means, please ask them, and I'll get them answered for you. Otherwise, if you like this podcast, I could ask you pretty please to go and leave us a review on Facebook, iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, wherever, Google+. That would be great, and it would help us very muchly. Okay, so let's jump right in.
Giving tradies and contractors around the globe the tools to run a modern business. You're listening to Toolbox Talks from the SiteShed. Now here's your host, Matt Jones.
Warren McGregor, welcome to the SiteShed podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you, Matt.
So, Warren, this is a podcast which I'm kind of excited to be doing because I know over the years, especially when I was working on the trades as a plumber, I did notice that there was a lot of things that were starting to change in the industry. There was a lot of technology being introduced. There were a lot of different applications and different processes and ways to build things. And what we're talking about today is certainly relevant to that because even when I was starting to phase myself out of the plumbing world, I noticed there are a lot of things starting to be introduced into the building environment, which were prefab, be that walls or many, many other different things. And I'm sure between the time that I've left and where we are today, there's been a lot more things that have been introduced. And obviously we've got a large audience of builders and tradespeople out there right around the world, and I'm sure they'll be very interested to see and listen to you and your experience as to where it's come so far, and then where it could potentially end up. The whole world of prefab.
Well, as you've alluded to there, Matt, it's a very I think, exciting space and a very changing space. And what's interesting is some of the parallels in different countries around the world are all getting some momentum at pretty much the same time. And when we think about it, whilst construction has been global in the sense that it happens all around the world, there hasn't been a lot of interplay across countries. And one of the things that offsite construction, prefabrication, modular, those terms that refer to the same broad space, has done is create some of those linkages. And one of the really interesting things about prefabrication in its most advanced state, let's say, is that it means that you can make an entire building can be made somewhere else and delivered to site and for rapid assembly. And that means that by separating the project site from the construction element, the construction doesn't need to happen locally or even in the same country. And we've literally got examples where whole buildings have been made in one country, transported and then put together, think Lego, Meccano type, rapid assembly on site. Obviously the connections and the other work has to be done at the last stage, but and that really has changed a whole lot of things that are going out there. And as you've suggested, there's activity in panel systems of various degrees, in full what we call volumetric, so full boxes that are fully fitted with apartments, hotels, medical suites, whatever McDonald's restaurants, they can be inside those things. They can be train stations. They can be all sorts of things. So there's plenty happening in there. And one thing I will just touch on now too, that's also an interesting space is more in line with your earlier background. One of the places you would have spent a bit of time is in the bathrooms and bathroom pods, what we call bathroom pods, a fully finished bathroom room.
Yep.
Being built in a factory now with the tiles, handrails, porcelain, everything in there probably except the toilet paper, and then being taken to site, rolled onto the floor if they're in an apartment building or a hotel, and rolled to the point that they need to be connected off to the services.
Yeah. Within
an hour of landing on that floor, they'll be commissioned.
Amazing.
So there's quite a lot happening in that space as well, and the people who've been our listeners who have been involved in that side of it know the kind of concentration of trades, materials, and defects resolution and all the mucking about in the wet areas. That's one of the reasons why that's been the takeoff area for offsite construction.
I know back in, or it would have been, I think it was like January of 2017, I had one of your colleagues, Bill, from Archiblocks on the podcast, and we were talking about modular homes. To be honest, that's pretty much the only episode I've recorded on modular style, prefab style building, and it was very interesting. I feel like we're going to go down a slightly different path on this podcast, which is great. However, you touched on the bathrooms, the modular bathrooms or the prefab bathrooms, and I've been seeing those overseas for years and years and years. Like for as long as I can remember, I've been seeing them in North America and places like throughout Europe. You know, they've all been doing this. Why are we only just starting to do this now?
Well, the US is not that common actually. There will have been some, and it's a bit like even here. There's some of the stuff that's been prefab in Australia has been going a very long time, and in some of the discussions I have, I refer to a church in Melbourne.
Yeah.
That was made of steel, prefabricated in the UK, and shipped to Australia for rapid assembly, and that was in 1850.
Oh, wow.
So what has been seen, the kind of logic about why prefab offsite can make sense in certain situations has been around a very long time.
Okay.
And in fact, there have been a lot of proponents of it who have said at various stages, now's when prefab's going to take off. And we had it in the US, we had it after wars. We had it here, rebuilding a lot of houses for servicemen coming back home. We had various stages where we've looked at and tried to do factory production of panels, houses, whatever in there, particularly around the housing state rather than the other kind of buildings. But for various reasons, it's never really gone on. And if we look at it now, I answer that question by saying, well, what's changed this time around? What are the enabling factors that are going to mean that this thing really gets going now? And the kinds of things we would talk about on that would be the technologies that are things. So we've got, the whole BIM space, the simulation tools, sensors, collaboration platforms, the whole thinking about lean manufacturing, design for manufacturing and assembly. That technology is crucial because one of the beauties of doing construction the way we've done it in the past is that we pretty much send all the materials and all the guys out there and we sort it out, and you can see it unfolding and you can identify issues and people are familiar with how to deal with it. If you start breaking this up and do it in different places, particularly different suppliers, this stuff's got to come together seamlessly when it gets to site. That means it has to exactly anticipate what every other bit's going to look like, and they have to be built, precision built. And that's been very difficult until we've had these kind of technologies where we can share the designs, do all the clash resolution of where the services are going to go, how the voids are going to be used, how all the joins are going to come together, what the fixings are. Then when we get to that state, so that's why this time around there's much more confidence that the thing's going to, and the wave has really started.
Okay.
But to come back to your comment about prefab bathrooms or bathroom pods, in Europe they are definitely the standard thing, and there wouldn't be a major hotel operator operating in Europe who would build a bathroom in situ anymore. And in fact, I've worked with some of the players who specialise in that area, and they can show you the specifications for each hotel brand, which define exactly what goes in there.
Okay.
To each one of their ones. And that's the point, they've got that too, so they can just order them. They're manufactured simultaneously with the site works, and they come in installed quickly, and the whole program runs faster as a result. We haven't really got to that point here.
No, but so while we're on the prefab bathroom things, a couple of obvious questions. We have a lot of plumbers that are listening to this, and I suppose a lot of people that do a bit of travelling. And my experience with prefab do you call them prefab bathrooms? What do you call them?
Well, bathroom pods is the most common term. Yeah.
Okay. So my experience with bathroom pods to date, anyway, is that when you're in a hotel room that has a bathroom pod, you can certainly tell. They sort of have a bit of a defining look about them. They kind of look a bit cheap, plasticky, and you can really tell the difference between an in situ bathroom and a bathroom pod. So I'm wondering, is that space starting to be evolved as well?
Yes, I think there are two things that have kind of melded together in that, and I'm glad you brought up that kind of being able to identify some of this offsite stuff. And there is a kind of a stigma around some of the modular product, and all our listeners will have their own views about prefab and offsite and what it looks like and whether it's any good or not. And I think as a general comment, I would say every one of those views will be correct, but I doubt whether many of us, including me, have a full appreciation of the total spectrum of what's available out there now. And that's what's really changing now. And the design flexibility, the more projects that have been done, the better technologies. And in fact, the high-end, whether they be bathroom pods or apartment buildings or hospital wings or whatever they are, you cannot tell the difference to look at them. And that's actually the ultimate objective, is that it's just a superior way to deliver the same or even better quality than the other way.
The one thing that I noticed with the bathroom pods is the plastic walls and the drumminess of the walls in the past.
That was purely a design specification and a cost. That's nothing to do with the bathrooms now. Can be the most high end. They can be whatever the client wants, and they are not. That's not typical at all. That will be a bathroom that's designed for a particular price point, for a particular application. Okay. And that was where a lot of them operated at the start. Now the very high-end bathrooms you wouldn't believe in the most 5-6-star hotels are built off-site. So there's no limitations whatsoever on that anymore.
So while we're talking about limitations, the obvious question that I'm going to ask, coming from a plumbing background, is what happens if you've got a prefab unit which springs a water leak behind the shower assembly? How the heck do you get to it without chopping out tiles, opening up a wall, etc.?
Pretty much you do that, except that the processes and the materials and the plumbing techniques that you're using on the offsite ones are done by prescribed by the tradies and put in using the same stuff. So there's no real issue about dealing with that. They're not locked up boxes in the sense that you have to destroy them to get in the back to do any work on them.
Right. Because I know some of these, in the past, I've looked at some of these bathroom pods and I've thought, if there's a water leak behind, between the shower assembly and the basin unit, it springs a leak there, the whole thing's a sealed unit. How would you ever find where that leak's coming from?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think you were looking at some of the earlier iterations where there was much more fiberglassy, plasticky type elements on them. The stuff now, there certainly will be some of that stuff around. They may be going into certain applications. They may be going to some of the mining site setups and some other things. But the space that Prefab operates in and our members focus on are what we call permanent buildings. So that rather than transportables or relocatable or peculiar things like that. And so they're conventional tiles, they're conventional bathroom fittings. You don't have any of those limitations on it. What we do have in terms of take-up here, we've got different regulations around the country. One of the challenges for Australia, I guess, is that we have a federal system and states. We've often got different regulations and approval processes. And just to give you one example, in Queensland, it's a bit of a battle to get the efficiencies of a bathroom pod manufacturer and still meet the sign-off requirements, which at the moment require a council inspector to come and check the plumbing before it's covered up. Mm-hmm. And if you're trying to run a production line and you need to stop it all the time so that somebody can come and check it and sign it off, you're not going to get the efficiencies of running that thing through. And for example, in Victoria, the qualified tradesperson is allowed to self-certify that product. Their name will go on that thing, and that can keep moving through the process. So there are some bits and pieces where the new processes clash with our traditional building regulations, let's say. Not so much the code, because everything has to be code compliant. Doesn't matter how it's manufactured. So that's not an issue for it. But in terms of how it gets signed off, there's some clunkiness that still needs to be worked out there.
And is that code, your basic, AS Australian standard code, or does it have its own specific, bathroom pod code, for example?
No, it hasn't. In the sense that for occupancy certificates and for the sign off and handover to a purchaser or of an apartment, for example, it's the same requirements. In fact, the building code doesn't prescribe how you get there. It's got to be it prescribes what you've got at the end, and so all these have to be certified to the same standard, no matter how they're built. So that's not really an issue.
When we're talking about the materials that are typically used, and we may as well just keep on track here with the bathroom pods for now, but we'll get off that soon. I mean, I'm guessing that in terms of the plumbing, the water pipe work and things like that, I'm guessing it's some sort of plastic piping in the walls, right?
It's whatever the client prescribed.
Okay.
High-end stuff or the low-end stuff. And really, it's one of the interesting things about it. It's when it's not a product. Prefab, in a sense, is not a product or a standard or a quality per se. It is a different means of putting the building together or the bathroom pod together, which will have whatever the architect or client has prescribed for those fittings and fixtures and tiles and whatever it is.
So you can effectively still have a bathroom pod that's been roughed in with copper pipe.
Yes, you can. If that's what you want, you can have that.
Oh wow! Okay, cool. So one of the things that
just on that, Matt. Sorry to jump in on there. Just to give you an extreme example, there's an instance where Kerlite is a very very high end Italian. Let's call it a ceramic sheet that can be used in place of tiles, so you don't have all the grout and other things on there. And that has been used in some offsite bathrooms as a more efficient way, even though it's a much more expensive material, to build that bathroom, because the bathroom pod itself, the shape and dimensions of it, are within millimetre tolerance because of the way the frame has actually been put together. Mm-hmm. So the Kerlite can be pre-cut to fit that exact wall with any cutouts that are required for services or access or whatever, and then basically picked up and put on is one sheet on that wall. So you get a beautiful finish, and you just do the corner joints, and it goes together much quicker for a very high-end thing. In fact, the developer on that project was stunned that they were able to put that in in a high-rise apartment building in Melbourne. He said, he's doing a very expensive, his own home. He said, that's what I've chosen for my home. How can you put it in there? So, well, that's the economics has changed because we don't have someone laying all those tiles on there. We've got someone who can pick this up, put it in one piece. And that's only possible when you know that the room's structure and framing is going to be within 1 mil tolerance because of the way you built that to start with.
God, I would just be so paranoid about like a breaching piece leaking or something behind the wall and having to smash that whole panel out to to get to it.
Well, then you can put that panel back in. But anyway, yes. Yeah, but there's no reason why this should, in fact, there should be less reason why this should leak.
Oh, no, I appreciate that. I mean, but I know from, back as a maintenance plumber, when you look at even things like slight structural movements which can cause brazed joints to start leaking and things like that. I mean, you can't foresee that kind of thing. That's just the nature of the landscape. And sometimes those things that sort of stuff will happen, like no one builds it, thinking that it will. But I mean, inevitably it will at some point. So I'm just, yeah. I suppose that raises another point as well, that in a situation where you do have to, remove a panel for whatever reason, what's the validity of, say, that product that you just spoke about that comes out of Europe being available in 10, 15 years so you can replace it?
Well, that's an issue with styles and colours of tiles of anything. They're very fashion type items, so right. I wouldn't hesitate to guess on that. But I'm not sure it's going to be any better or worse than other contemporary finishes that we're putting in the bathrooms.
So, when we're talking about installing, say, a bathroom pod, I'm very curious as to at what stage of the building process these things have to be put in, because obviously if you've got confined walls and you've got a roof over top, you're not going to be able to drop a pod in there, right?
Let's talk about the most common applications of them, which would be in apartment / student accommodation or hotel. So high-rise buildings where you've got repeats of that kind of bathroom configuration, even though you might have different versions of it through the building, but you'll have multiples of each one. And in that setup, what typically happens once you've got your core up and your floors in, before you've done anything on the facade, they will land the required number of bathroom pods on that floor. Yeah. And then they just wheel them to their respective spots before you've done much else with the fit out.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. And then I suppose it's just a matter of plumbing up the whatever's comes out of the pod, plumbing that up to existing plumbing, and off you go.
Yes, the design of the existing plumbing and the services point on that pod intended to be, that's all got to be pre-thought out rather than done.
Of course.
And that's how that last exercise can happen in under an hour to commission those.
And so in terms of like the code and all that kind of stuff, when you're putting a pod in and when you're designing the hydraulic infrastructure, behind the, say the stack work for the sewerage or perhaps the, the water lines and all that kind of stuff. First of all, I'm at the risk of asking a ridiculous question. I'm guessing that when those pods come, they've already been pressure tested and they're all certified and ticked off, right?
Yes, they are. Yes.
Okay, cool. And so secondly, like from a design perspective, how do those pods comply with things like ventilation and all that kind of stuff?
You're getting a bit technical for me.
Yeah,
they have to comply in the same way. The process of designing the bathroom by the architect and the engineers and whoever else needs to get involved in those dimensions of it is the same. It's just where it's built.
Yeah.
So they need to be specified right down to that level.
Okay, so if they need to pull a vent off at high level, then that can all come as part of the prefab.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, cool. Sorry, I'm getting a bit nerdy there with that sort of stuff, but it's just questions that I've always wanted to ask someone who was in the game.
Fine. That's your territory, man.
Right. Well, not anymore, but yeah, it certainly was at one point. But anyway, okay, so moving ahead, I suppose, moving away from the bathroom side of things a little bit, one of the things that I've started seeing being introduced quite commonly back when I was plumbing was the prefabbed concrete wall setup. So instead of, having a million brickies out there throwing up bricks on the walls there, they just basically bring a crane in with a panel, drop it in place, and then bolt another one on top of it. It seems to me like a lot of these high-rise buildings now, it's kind of common practice.
What was the last comment, Matt? It seems
like buildings, with a lot of these new buildings that are being constructed around the place, that seems to be common practice these days. Like it's most of them are leaning towards that sort of style.
Yeah. the precast walls, what I think we were talking about the same thing. That is very much a common part of the space, and it's excuse me, and it's part of the whole prefabrication, offsite construction space. They're doing some interesting things in there, but that's relatively well established, I would say, rather than something that's undergoing a lot of change at the moment. And I think if we talk about the panels, and particularly the blind walls, right? For example, in in CBD buildings where you've got buildings right next to each other, blind walls is a classic way to tackle that. There's some the panel world though is much broader than that these days, because we can get timber frame panels, we can get steel gauge, light gauge steel frame panels that can go in not just high-rise buildings, but low-rise and domestic and other applications, whereby they can have the framing even and one cladding, either the internal or the external, depending on what makes most sense for the job. They can often increasingly be delivered to site with windows and doors in them. So what that looks like is a bit more along the lines of like an IKEA flat pack bookcase or whatever. You open it up and this one's, pre-cut corners and here's the fixings and get this together. And when they go together for rapid assembly on there. And that's very much along the lines of the Swedish panelised building system that they've been doing kind of 40 years or so. They went down that path for a few reasons, but one of which is they've got very harsh winters and long winters. So they have quite short time available on site when they can do stuff sensibly. They're still waiting. They wait 3 weeks for a slab to get to the point where they can do anything else on it, and that's in the good part of the year for them because of the weather over there. So they've got to quite advanced stages, and where it makes most sense in other countries and for a particular project will be quite project specific. The availability of trades is getting to lock up the most critical thing, what are weather conditions and various things. But you can take them; they can be taken to the point where they're what we call closed panels. So the internal linings are on the wall, the external cladding's on the wall frame, the insulation's in there, and you either have the conduits for your services or you can actually have the services pre-configured in the wall, ready so that when you put this together, you can move it quite quickly. And there's an example of, and this one is not the closed panel setup, but I'm giving you an example of one that's being trialled in Melbourne at the moment, 3-storey townhouse, actually a pod of 5 townhouses, where the panels are what we call an open panel. They've got the external cladding on them, but not the internal in there. And they were able to take that block of 5 townhouses, 3-storey townhouses, from slab to lock up in 1 week.
What?
And that's because they're basically picking up off the back of the truck the wall panels first that have got the doors and windows in them. Then they put what we call a floor cassette on top of that, which is the floor structure, top and bottom. Then they put the next floor wall panels on, floor cassette, next wall panels, and the roof structure on there. The panels come with the first layer of render already on, and then it's just a matter of doing the joints and top coating the render, and you're ready for the tradies to come and fit out the building from the inside.
Good grief. So you've actually brought up 2 things that I wanted to talk about. First of all was the slabs, which you've kind of addressed there with the slab cassette. So effectively the walls go in first and then they've got some sort of supporting bracket that the slabs come down and sit on top of, right?
What I was referring to in that instance was a floor cassette. So these are wood
they're
floor
timber.
cassettes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So is there such thing as a prefabbed concrete floor, or does that not really exist?
Yeah, look, there are variations of that, and if we go back to the precast space you were talking about before, there are some what they call we can do it heavyweight, but obviously that puts greater demands on your walls and how you're holding it up and your substructure and things. But there's a kind of a hollow core concrete concept now where they can get lighter versions with some very impressive spans, 16, 17 metre spans on that. The other way that's accomplished, and it gets into the space that I call the kind of the hybrid materials, whereby if you want to get and I think you're alluding to this, you want to get the feel of a solid structure under you, but with the speed and efficiency and lightweight of a wood floor cassette, you can either do some kind of screed, which we've seen in various projects here and overseas, or you can use an aerated concrete tile product like a Hebel.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And by using those combinations, you can achieve the desired level of, you eliminate any bounce in the floor. You get that solid feel and structure. You get some of the acoustic separation qualities you're looking for.
Yeah.
So it becomes a matter then of saying, well, it's not just going to be this or that. What are we trying to achieve? What's the best mix of materials to accomplish that?
We interrupt this podcast today to talk to you very quickly about Tradie Web Guys' content creation program. That program has been designed specifically for trade-based organisations as a way that you guys as trade business owners can start creating content that enables you to engage better with your customers and your potential customers. It will enable you to build trust and build rapport because what you're doing is you're investing in educating them. Biggest problem that we see with our customers today is that they're not regularly updating their websites. And that's a problem because first of all, the search engines are looking for that. And second of all, potential customers are also looking for it. Tradie Web Guys' content creation program has been specifically designed to help you get regular, relevant content on your website consistently every month. We know that it's hard when you're out there on the tools, and we know that sometimes you don't always have the time to be able to do these things yourself. So we're taking it off your hands for you. It's a service that we're offering for you guys. We want to make sure that you're getting this done because we know how important it is. Anyway, head across to tradiewebguys.com.au/content, fill in the form, and one of our representatives will come back to you. The other thing that you touched on briefly, which I'd like to elaborate on a little bit, is the obviously they've been using this stuff throughout Europe for a long time. Europe gets pretty cold, so the thermal capacity of these products. Now, I know living here in Sydney, when you look at some of the older buildings, like the one I'm living in right now, even though it's a double bricked house, thermally it's bloody terrible in the winter. So I'm wondering if, these things, obviously they would have to comply with whatever it is, our basic requirements over here and that kind of stuff. Being that technology comes out of Europe, I'm guessing that it's pretty well built for thermal capacity.
Well, that's a design, issue, Matt, and a cost issue, because one of the reasons why we've got away with it in Australia is partly our
climate,
our general climate, but also it costs more to do. And one of our builders, for example, who went on our study tour last year to Sweden, we were looking at this, beautiful, beautiful triple glazed, thermally broken frame windows and doors, and and it looked like something like $80,000 a house.
Yeah, okay.
And that would just be prohibitive for most housing applications in Australia. But we are seeing more double glazing happening, and we're seeing some triple glazing here, and we're seeing a more refined approach to getting their framing with the thermal break in them, because the first iterations in Australia, many of them, the glass was doing its job, but the frame wasn't, and the thermal imagery would just show the heat and cold transfer running through the frames rather than. So you do have to get the whole package right, otherwise it's the weak point in it. But one of the things that offsite construction can do is, because it's more controlled factory environment where they're being made, if you are running high energy efficiency specifications, you've got a better control mechanisms to make sure that it's built to the design to achieve that, rather than perhaps getting some compromises on site, or some things didn't really fit together, some insulation missing, some whatever it is. You just need to have some spaces where you've got air leakage out of your building, or poor thermal breaks in some elements of it, and the weather will find its way through there, as you've discovered on yours. It's probably your windows, I expect.
It would be for sure.
Some other unintended ventilation happening in your building that's achieving that.
I don't even know where the breeze comes through in this place. Sometimes it's like everything's shut. Where does that breeze come from? But anyway. So
one of the things they do these days, Matt, is they do what they call a blower door test. So they will close all the windows and doors.
Yeah.
And then they'll replace your front door with a door that's got a blower in it, an air blower in it, and they'll pump it up and see how much air it holds, and see how long it holds that air for, and what the air transfer is without you doing anything. Really? Just going through leakage. Yeah.
Okay. Like a pressure test.
Yeah, in effect. And it looks at the turnover of the air in there, which is one of the important things from controlling energy costs. It's very much a part of the passive house concept, which is a very high-end, low energy usage specification out of Europe.
Yep.
But if you've got airflows happening that not intending, then you're really undermining all your efforts.
Fascinating.
It's like the door open somewhere.
So we've spoken about some of the more common, I suppose, applications for the prefab sort of stuff. What are some of the less common or some of the evolving spaces where prefab's starting to make a bit of a footprint?
Well, some interesting ones we've had in Victoria, I know. I'm not sure about other places where train stations have been manufactured in factories. And we're talking about either existing train stations that are having to be rebuilt or improved or expanded, where you've got daily traffic. So you really need to minimise your impact on the daily commuters. And the first ones that were done were a few years ago, actually, in Melbourne. They were designed in Europe, the London designers, with no thought to how they would be built, which actually, in a funny way, is the way most designs are done, not really thinking about how it's going to be built. That becomes the engineers and the other people and the builder and the tradies problem to sort out how it's going to be built, which is one of the very odd things about construction, to my mind. I mean, I've been in construction my whole life, but let's see it's in one of those situations, you wouldn't design a car without knowing how every bit's going to be sourced, how you're going to service it, how you're going to put it together. You wouldn't do planes like that. Yeah. And interestingly, some of the design for manufacturing and assembly and the digital engineering that we're increasingly seeing in the construction space for buildings has evolved in the automotive and aerospace, where they're thinking about that on day one. How it's going to come together, where it's going to be, what shapes they are, what's standard, what's not standard, where are the guys going to be when they're, and girls in that case, where are they going to be when they're installing that? Does that mean we're going to need scaffolding or not need scaffolding? What are the access points? What's all that is actually thought of up front. That hasn't been the way we've gone about construction up to now.
Well, it's certainly true, and the way they normally get around it here in Australia is, well, it's design and construct, so here's the designer, you go figure it out. But that certainly wouldn't be overly relevant, I imagine, when you're talking about prefabrication, which raises another point which I wanted to ask you in the terms of that digital design space. So, I mean, obviously, if you're going to come up with a design for a bathroom pod, for example, that then has to comply, I suppose, and consider, all the other services, be that, HVAC or, electrical and all that kind of stuff. So when a building or when they're looking to, I suppose, build a construction that's going to incorporate an element or, a facet of the prefabrication within it, does that, that coordination with the design process of that specific product, that would have to be very heavily influenced by the designers of all the other infrastructure, right? I mean, your mechanical engineers and all that kind of stuff.
You've alluded to, you're exactly right, Matt. What this does, when the more offsite construction you do, the more front end resolution of the design and all those elements has to happen. It doesn't unfold as you're going during the course of the build for two reasons. One is because you've got to have it all to consider all the other elements, but also you don't get the benefits of offsite construction and the concurrent work program until you've started building that stuff offsite, and you can't start building it until you've said what it's going to be and what the fittings are going to be and how big the room is and how many tiles you need. And if you haven't defined all that, you can't start it.
Yeah.
And it does front end load. And one of the challenges of the change that prefabrication brings about to various degrees, but if you're going to do a lot of it offsite, it changes a lot about that whole the whole thinking and about how you get organised and even who your project team is and how you design it and how you deliver it and even how you procure it, because the contracting can be influenced. If you've got a lot of a contract, and I'm thinking of one Western Australian hotel, probably 70% of the cost of the building was the apartment modules that came from a supplier in this case. That's a fundamentally different makeup of the procurement and contract and the build record only really directly, he oversaw the other stuff, but he didn't directly make 70% of what went into the building that he's a record for. So it does, and that's one of the reasons why it's been a slower take up, and in certain sectors for prefabrication is because it does fundamentally change the way we organise ourselves. It has some issues for funding.
Yeah.
And when we think about the manufacturing type business model, which we're really starting to, if we're talking about companies that make bathroom pods for different projects, and they might need, a couple of hundred to a typical hotel or student accommodation project could be 600 bathrooms. So you need to be able to run at scale, but you also need to have a flow of next orders, because if you have a factory and you have your workforce and you have your technologies and your machinery and all that stuff there, you can't leave it dormant for patches in between. And that's one of the big changes, the more manufacturing we bring to construction compared to the traditional model where there's a lot of subbies and you scale up when you've got projects on and you scale back down again. That's a natural kind of adjustment. We don't have that in there. So that also changes. The business models change a little bit on this stuff as well.
So, that is a big limitation, I suppose, or potential limitation when you're talking about, demand and being able to supply that demand from, if, for example, if you do need to build a hotel that's got 600, bathrooms within it, where at the moment would that come from? Is there factories here locally that do this stuff, or does it all have to come out of Europe, or what's the go?
No, we've probably got a dozen bathroom pod manufacturers in Australia, and probably 4 to 6 who would be credible tenderers for 600 bathroom pod projects. Yep. The other ones would can operate at different levels with different volumes, but that is starting to be created now. Now for the volumes, the other part of the volume is that apart from the business model changing to really reap what everyone would like to see happen and get some cost decreases rather than just be cost competitive and maybe be higher quality and maybe be quicker on the program for the project, but to actually achieve some cost reductions through the manufacturing processes and supply chain management things. Yeah. We need to get to some volume. We need to get some scale.
Right.
And until we get a broader take-up in the industry, it's hard to get the efficiencies from scale if we're not running at scale. Yeah. And Australia's a relatively small market to start with. So it's quite interesting, but we're getting some people who are investing in the technologies that can do more and more of this stuff efficiently in the factories. So we're starting to make some interesting progress on that front. And if I look at more, let's say, resolved, more established models in Sweden, for example, there are some big panel manufacturers. They're timber. They're very much a timber psyche in Sweden. They grow a lot of timber. They value add to their timber industry, and in fact, they end up with more. They got more timber growing each year than what they harvest, even though they're big players in the timber industry. But they some of the ones who are very big scale, heavily invested in technology, will have a couple of offtakes. They'll be selling to the broader market, and they will have their own development activities, so they can marry across those two. And if, for example, some of their customer orders get delayed or slow down for a while, they'll run the factory at an efficient level and run more of the product through to their own projects and keep the volume happening that way.
There's a million things that I wanted to talk about, that I could keep talking about here, but I really, you've touched on something which was a big thing that I'd like to talk about for both personal reasoning and I suppose for the benefit of the listeners out there, which is the environmental advantages.
Yep.
And I don't know, when we spoke offline a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the advantages in the space of waste reduction and how when you're not building on site, of course, there's far less stuff that offcuts and all that kind of carry on.
Yep.
What about from a product perspective itself, like the stuff that's being used in the construction of these products? How do they fare in the space of environmentally friendly, renewable, sustainable solutions, that kind of stuff?
The actual materials that are being used will be a function of the design specification and what the client says. But what it does, because of the efficiencies in the supply chain management and the precision in the use of them and the reduction in wastage, it makes it more amenable and more efficient to use higher end ecological products, which tend to be more expensive, you can counter some of the cost of the thing because you're using it in a more efficient way.
Right.
Because you don't have the wastage, you don't have the breakage, you don't have whatever's happening out on site in there, and you can be very specific in the way you order the sizing of that stuff because you've got very precise plans and very precise requirements for your bills and materials that you can take off there. And so we're seeing in some of these operations here and others we visited, we had a study tour to the US and Canada last month, in some of those things where they're buying non-standard material sizes from the supplier because it means they're not having off carts, double handling, joining up. They can use them in an efficient way because they know exactly what they're going to need rather than having to kind of be a bit iterative and see what's happening on site and got some extra ones or go to another whole box and just see what we need. They can be very specific, and when they get down to the details on the digital engineering, they know how many screws they're going to need of which size for that project. And they can even have, for the bathroom pods, they can have a set of the ceramics and the tiles and everything go to that station rather than getting the boxes of all the tiles you need for the 600 bathrooms. You get them delivered in a pack for a bathroom,
right?
That goes to that station. So you can even take out a lot of the packaging that is normally associated with the way that stuff's dealt with.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So there are a whole lot of things that are just starting to now evolve in there when we think about the supply chain management. So from the ability to incorporate cost efficiently, higher ecological standard products, it's helpful to be doing it in this way because for all those reasons.
And you mentioned as well, I mean, and that makes sense, I suppose, if you want to make this a cost-effective alternative to traditional building, then it would normally come in the space of volume. So, if you are building, a hotel with 600 bathrooms in it or whatever, then it's going to be obviously cheaper than getting a single pod for a single house.
Yeah.
So is it typically at this point in time, is it really, when we talk about prefabrication, is it kind of customized more towards the commercial development, construction side of building as opposed to residential?
It's both. But they're different players that tend to be doing it. Many of our members do make detached dwellings. They make individual houses in a factory environment, though they can do both kind of a standard set of designs which can have the normal variations that someone could ask for, and they can also do them totally bespoke. So there are multi-million-dollar homes, not house and land. I'm talking about homes being built and being transported, built in Melbourne, for example, and sent to Sydney for waterfront homes. So there are people, but they tend to be different firms. There's not somebody kind of been doing big scale in here, one-offs over there. They're quite specialised endeavours with different skill sets in them. But some of the players have now brought in-house the kind of the engineering, all the skill set in there, so they can be pretty much self-contained and deliver the whole project to the customer for a home, for example, rather than having different tiers of people and the customer unsure who's responsible for this bit, who's doing all the footings, what about this, who do I go back to if there's a problem later on, if there's a supplier building this in the factory. Some of them say, we do the whole thing. We are the builder, we are the manufacturer, we ran your project for you, you deal with us, that's the end of the story.
Okay, so just two more questions, conscious of your time and the listeners out there. First of all, from a installation perspective, obviously the prefab is being done in a factory somewhere, so a lot of the bulk work, has been carried out by the supplier themselves. Who is then responsible for installing the product into the dwelling? And I'm talking about, I suppose, realistically from a licensing and compliance perspective.
The builder can have their own arrangements at installation and or back-to-back warranties with the supplier on their own case. They would normally also have vetted any supplier that they would be using on a larger project, for example, and customarily had some inspections during the course of the works that were happening off-site. So it's not a kind of a mysterious thing that just appears one day. It's very much a part of it, although it's a different part to what it normally is because it's happening in a different place. But that hasn't been one of the issues that we've had a lot of problem with.
Okay, so but in terms of like a certification perspective, if you guys supply the pod, then you don't need a certain sort of, say, plumbing qualification in order to connect to it. Like any plumber can.
Yes, any qualified plumber who's authorised to certify the final connections can do that. There's not the idea is that we're not building something that's got different connections and different things and create a whole new mistake on it.
Right.
The materials and the connections will be customary. They'll just be concentrated in one section of that bathroom pod, ready to be connected off.
Okay, cool. And from a servicing perspective, is it the same thing? Like, could any say qualified electrician, qualified plumber do the servicing on a bathroom pod?
Yep. Yeah, it is. Nobody's trying to make these specific, so you've got to go back to the supplier to keep it. No, there's no indication of that whatsoever. And I think that would be a major handicap if anybody tried to go down that path.
Okay. And I suppose the last question that I had for you was you've spoken and you just mentioned that hasn't been one of your problems to date. What are some of the more common problems that you have been experiencing? If not you personally, but you know what I mean, the industry.
Yeah, no. There's we're the industry association, so it's our members who are caught up in this stuff. Well, I think the education process is one of the more interesting parts about it, because often, for example, the guys making bathroom pods, and I know we're focused a lot on that, and there are plenty of other things, but let's keep it in that context for now. They look at some of the designs they get given and say, you realise, if we made this 30 mil longer wall, we don't have to cut all the tiles down that side. Yeah, and other designs where they say, look, this height is it? We need to do it like this because our materials come in these standard sizes, and we're happy. We can make them whatever size you want, but we're doing an extra exercise here, and it's costing us money, going to cost you money, it's going to take us time. And if we can take that out of the process, this thing's going to move a lot smoother. So I think it's not so much a problem, but it's more an educative
communication.
Yeah, so I think with this, we're the guys who are thinking about doing this in a factory are all over these kind of dimensions. We're more on site to say, well, if that's the space I've got, that's what we ended up with, I'm going to make it fit, and I know how to do that.
Yeah.
Whereas they're back a step and saying, hey, a better way to do this, or what about this, what about that? And to create that more collaborative discussion early on is really one of the fundamental changes with it, what we call early contractor involvement with how the design's going to be from an efficiency point of view, and early supplier involvement too, where a supplier is a big part of the project, have those discussions earlier on and iron out some of that stuff. And because they do this stuff day to day. They've got a lot of good suggestions. You may not take them all up, but it's good food for thought. And some of them are just blindingly obvious, but not picked up normally. And if it's too far down the design development process, they've got to wear it, and the project ultimately wears it.
I can certainly imagine that paradigm alone would be a pretty confronting hurdle for a lot of organisations that are so tied into the traditional way of running, a building project. Having to really knuckle down and screw down on that communication initially, that is so paramount.
Yeah, Matt, confronting is exactly the word I would have used that you used there, and it's changed this idea about being collaborative and having those discussions as opposed to the more combative type approach. Say, here's what it is. How much is it going to cost? What's your price? What's your tender price to do that bid for us? It's fundamentally different. Yet it's exactly what is done with the automotive and aerospace.
Yeah, where
they're talking to the suppliers who are making, the gear sticks or the instrument pods or whatever. As they're putting this thing together, they're saying, what about this? Or this is our spec. We need this functionality. You guys know all the materials. You know how it needs to work. We're not going to tell you every bit and then try to screw down on the price to make something inefficiently that because we don't understand it, which is what we're doing in a lot of our construction industry, saying these are our performance specifications. This is what we need. You need 2 bathrooms, it's going to be minimum of this, we're going to have that. This energy rating, these kind of sustainability dimensions. If there's a disability performance standard we want for the building, tell us all that. Give us the broad things, and then you can get something back that will do the job better than you could have come up with without all this toing and froing over some months. Now, it's not always going to work for Phil, but just that different change in mindset is fundamentally confronting, and it can also affect relationships established relationships with their own tradespeople.
Yeah.
You know, if we start, for example, if somebody started to introduce bathroom pods on some of their projects, they're not then using the trades that they've been using on their other projects.
Yeah.
They're established relationships that people are very hesitant about disrupting.
So, Warren, I suppose before we close off, and this has been a brilliant conversation. I'm thrilled that we've had it because I've learned a lot for sure, and I know a lot of listeners out there would have as well. A couple of things before we talk about the upcoming conference that you guys are running, but where's the future of this going? Like, where is this prefab future heading?
I think what we'll find is it becomes increasingly mainstream, and the real turning point for that will be when it's identified as being a superior outcome to conventional ways. And we're not quite at that point yet, but what is interesting is we've had, just talking about Australia alone, we've had very successful prefab projects in transport, in other parts of infrastructure, medical suites, hospitals, every kind of residential, from standalone housing, townhouses, student accommodation, mid-rise apartment buildings, high-rise apartment buildings. We're starting to get that footprint across pretty much every kind of building type. We've had McDonald's restaurants built in Melbourne and installed Western Australia and Northern Territory in remote locations. The full setup build, fully run the kitchens, run the whole thing, detach it, take it away and put it back together in a couple of weeks on site. So we've now got, Australia is interesting, we've got small scale, but that's forced us to look across the various different markets. So we've now got a nice embedded thing. We've got many more of the builders, clients, tradies, technical people, engineers who are all familiar with this stuff. So this is just a matter now of, it is the future to do more of this stuff. It's not a smooth path to get there, and I think we'll increasingly see it, and it'll become a little bit more, accepted as not being that different and not that unusual. And if we go back to one of the earlier transformations, if we think about plaster, hard plaster in the old days, Latham plaster, that was plasterboard was the first prefab version of plaster, the old hard plaster. It's not considered anything like that. The robotic, the robot vacuum cleaners, we just think of them as vacuum cleaners now. We're starting to move into that space, and I think we've probably got increased momentum, and we've got much more interest in at this, and we're getting some endorsement of offsite construction by governments in Singapore in particular is mandating offsite construction in various ways. Yep. The UK government is heavily endorsing and now looking to move to where they're going to prescribe that 20% of their procurement is offsite, so they can help create the volume that's required for the industry to invest in the skills and the manufacturing processes, so they can get this stuff to happen. So we're at a very interesting stage. It's not going to happen instantly, but it's a very interesting stage for us. So become more pervasive. And just to finish off, as you mentioned, we Prefab Oz is the Offsite Construction Industry Association. So it's our members who are involved in this industry, and they can be people who make these modules, panels, supply the equipment. They're the builders who are involved in finishing off these projects and incorporating this stuff. The architects, engineers, clients, research agencies, there are a whole host of different people. And really it's that whole kind of ecosystem that's required to bring about this kind of change. So we have a number of events during the year. We have study tours overseas, but our feature event is the annual conference. This year it's in September, 10th to the 12th September at the Brisbane Convention Exhibition Centre. So, that's where we're at.
And so what's the type of guests that you would typically like to see there? Is it builders, or what sort of people are you looking for that sort of, who would benefit from it? I suppose I just want to ask you.
Yeah, well, it's people who want to know more about what's happening in this space. We will have leading practitioners from Australia as well as international speakers. We have speakers and delegates come from overseas because what we're doing here in Australia, whilst not big in scale, is very interesting, and some of it is at the leading edge of quality and sophistication of what's going on. So people who have heard something about it, thinking about what step they might think about taking, want to see some case studies about projects that incorporated offsite construction and how they went, and to see who the other players are in it. We've got an exhibition area where some of the suppliers are also exhibiting. So it's kind of like if someone is interested in this area, we've got architects, engineers, all sorts of professions attend as well as present at our conference. So it's not just the physical side of things, but it's a kind of a crash course to, if for someone who's interested in it, rather than having a meeting here, a little bit here, 3 months later get another bit, you can compress this into 2 or 3 days. The first day is a site visit program where we actually visit. This mix from year to year, but in this case it'll be one of the factories which is producing housing and school buildings, and a couple of projects. One is a big cross-laminated timber CBD office building, the largest by floor area in the world across laminated timber in Brisbane, and another is a townhouse development using light gauge steel framing manufactured in the factory and sent out for rapid assembly. So get a bit of taste of practical projects on site and in the factory on day one. The other 2 days is those presentations and discussion panels.
Okay, brilliant. Well, look, I can't promise that this episode is going to be live before that event goes out, but I will definitely post a link to it within the Facebook community so all the guys in there know that it's on. I know there's a few guys up in Brisbane that would be very interested in this, so I dare say they will be a ring-in. Anyway, Warren, thank you.
We'll have one next year too, Matt, and the next year's one will be in Sydney. So
okay, all right.
Around.
Well, you just keep us in the loop with that sort of stuff anyway, and we'll definitely put the word out there for you. Warren McGregor, thank you very much for your time. It's been informative. It's been educational. It's been fun.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Matt.
And so if people want to find out more about Prefab Oz, they can head across to prefaboz, all one word, .org.au. That's prefabaus.org.au. There's a lot of information on that page there, and they are across social media as well. So if you wanted to follow them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, you can also find that through the website. Warren, I'll post some links to that stuff within the show notes, of course. And for the listeners out there, if you've got any questions that I suppose you inevitably will have in the space of prefab, by all means, wherever you see this episode posted, whether that's comes through in one of our emails or if it's across social media, if you want any answers to the questions, by all means, just hit me up, and I'm sure Warren will be more than happy to either come back on the show and answer them or answer them for you within the Facebook community or something like that. Warren, I think that's all, mate. I think we're pretty much there. Is there anything you wanted to add?
No, that's fine. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity, Matt.
Okie dokie. Well, that is a wrap. You've been listening to the SiteShed podcast. I'm Matt Jones, and we look forward to speaking to you in the following episodes. Thank you for listening to another episode of Toolbox Talks. If you're liking what you hear, then you can head across to the siteshed.com where you can join our community by signing up to our Toolbox Talks. You'll get sent a weekly notification, which is basically a highlight of everything that we've spoken about during that week, along with any other industry news that may be relevant or specific to the trades. If you're enjoying the show, you can head across to iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, where you can leave us a review. That would be fantastic, and all the reviews get read out in the show. Likewise, if you have any friends or colleagues that you think would benefit from the show and the episodes that we create, then please go ahead and share it with them.